Welcome everybody to learn to load the frame with more than one project. So I looked at the roster tonight and I saw who's on. On the live session, there are a lot of you that have taken webinars from me in the past. So my question to you is, what have you loaded besides a quilt on a frame? What other things have you loaded? Because we're going to load the frame. We're going to talk about and learn how to load the frame with many things. So I want to know, have you loaded the frame with other things other than a quilt, a wall hanging? Here's some tips on loading the frame. Okay? Same backing. So the question always is, when I load a frame with more than one project, do I have to use the same backing? Not necessarily. I could use the same backing. And people ask, why do I load the frame with more than one thing? Well, if I have a 10-foot or a 12-foot frame, I want to utilize as much space as possible. So what I do is I try to load the frame with what I can, as much as I can, at the same time. So yes, you can use a backing that's the same. So if you're on a 10-foot frame, maybe you want a 109-inch backing. If you're on a 12-foot frame, maybe you want a 118-inch backing. That would be all the same piece. Now keep in mind that that 108 or 118-inch backing could go the length of your frame by the length of the fabric, meaning that from left to right, I could make that backing as long as I needed to, or as short as I needed to, and then take the selvage to selvage on my leaders. So think about that. So that would be the same backing piece, one piece of fabric, the same size all the way across the frame. The next one would be that you piece the backing together. So maybe you have two wall hangings. The two wall hangings have different backings. You could stitch those together. Maybe there's multiple backings, or maybe there's multiple fabrics making the backing. What I mean by that is, take all your scraps, sew them together, big pieces, whether they're fat quarters or whatever they are, sew them together and make those your backing. Make those what becomes the backing for whatever it is you're going to put on the frame. So a lot of times I'm making samples. And are backs important? Well, backs can be important when people are looking at the back of it, but if it's a wall hanging, it's not as important as if it were a lap quilt or a bed quilt or something like that, or maybe even a placemat. So I will sew multiple pieces of fabric to make it as big as what I need. And it could look like a crazy quilt on the back. They're so hodgepodge, and that's okay. Now, you're going to sew all those together. If you're not concerned about the backings being different, meaning different squares, things like that, so you select a whole bunch of fabrics and sew them together, you just sew them together with your regular sewing thread. But let's just say you had two backings that you're sewing together. So here's what happened when I put my first quilt frame together and I put my first quilts on the frame. I had a 10-foot frame, and I already had a vision back then, and that was quite a while ago. That was, I'm going to guess, in 2006 or maybe 2005. I said, well, I've got two of these cheater quilts, so I'm going to quilt them at the same time. And when I quilt them, I'm going to quilt one freehand this way and one freehand this way, because this was before I had robotics. So they were cheater quilts. They weren't the same, so I could put different backs on. So I sewed those backs together with water-soluble thread. And I had two separate pieces of batting because I was also learning about batting. So I did one polyester and I did one cotton. So the batting did not even have to be the same. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Now, if I have two pieces of backing that I don't want to stitch together, I use grosgrain ribbon, or as you see it's spelled grosgrain ribbon, but it's grosgrain ribbon. And I kind of make a little leader that takes one piece of backing to one piece of backing with safety pins, and I hold those backings together with a grosgrain ribbon, and that gives the stabilization that I need between those fabrics that are kind of in air on the quilt frame. Now, you see it says embellisher there? So above that it says same batting. So we talked about the backing could be the same. Well, the batting can be the same. So if I'm doing a big piece and I have a big piece of batting, I put that big piece of batting on the frame and I'm good to go, and I cut it to the size that I need. Well, I have lots of scraps. I have a 3-bin hamper in my sewing room, and in that 3-bin hamper I have my scrap batting. I take my embellisher, which is a felting machine, and I felt the batting back together again. As long as they're similar in consistency, I wouldn't put a polyester batting that's entirely polyester with a cotton batting, but I would put cotton and cotton blends together, especially if they're small projects that I'm doing. It's not a big bed quilt, things like that. So I use the embellisher to put my pieces back together again. So here's a picture. If I'm loading the frame with the same fabric, my fabric would look like that. That would be my backing. It would be across the back, across the frame as you see it. So that's really important to think about, that if you're using the same backing, it's one big piece of fabric. Now here's an interesting thing. I asked, what things have you put on the frame that aren't necessarily a quilt or a wall hanging? So Brenda has put placemats. And Linda said she didn't ever think of anything else. She didn't think about loading anything else. Heather says that she's done nothing but practice pieces of fabrics or quilts. Shirley tried a sweatshirt, but it didn't come out as well as what she wanted it. So, there are ways to do sweatshirts that you can embellish on the quilt frame. And it also sometimes surely has to do with what sweatshirt you're using. I like the overdyed sweatshirts. They're a little bit easier to do than, say, the raglan sleeve polyester cotton blend sweatshirts. The overdyed sweatshirts are usually 100% cotton. Michelle said that, or is asking, will the seams on the backing affect the quilting process? Not at all. They will not affect the quilting process at all. Think about this, and I've done this, and some of you might have seen it. I've carried it with me to shows and things. I've made a quilt that's reversible. I did 2 quilts, exactly the same, different colors. One was on one side of the quilt and one was on the other side of the quilt. And quilting them did not affect either quilt, either side. So not at all. You can piece your backing all day long and have lots of fun with it. Jan said that she's done purses on the frame. So we're going to talk about some of these things that some of you have done, and some of you are thinking, I never thought of doing that. So we're going to talk about that. So you could load the frame with pieced backing. So look at this. This could be a small piece of blue, a piece of lavender, a piece of salmony, pink color, and then a gray. The question I would ask you, is it important that that seam lies a specific spot in your quilt? Because I have a friend, Judy. She does piece backings all the time, but she has to, and it's okay, there's nothing wrong with this, and she's probably on the webinar. She has to have those seams and those things land exactly in a specific spot. So if you need that to happen, you have to be specific on how you sew them together. If that's not important and you're learning from this experience, then just sew them together. You could have a seam across the middle of that going left to right, and that would be okay. So pieced backing, think of it this way. A piece backing can be pieced any way you want, and there's nothing at all wrong with that. Donna says that she always does her baby quilts reversible. And so, there are lots of ways, lots of thought processes. And for anybody that knows me, there's no right or wrong way. What I give you is suggestions, and you're going to take elements from it and do what it is you want. But there's no rules. So try. Brenda would like to know, have I ever quilted it on the reverse, the backing on top and the quilt on the bottom? She says she read that somewhere. I have not quilted it in reverse, although by saying that I did a reversible quilt, which side's the right and which side's the wrong, you know, that you could say that was in reverse. I have also done the table runner, the project, in the Quilt Magician, and I had my tension balanced so much or so well that you can't tell the front from the back. So I haven't really told myself I've quilted with the backing up, but I don't see why you couldn't. Here is where I had talked about two separate pieces. So I want you to think about the blue just showing you the frame. That's not fabric. The turquoise is one piece of backing, and the peach is another piece of backing. And what I had said earlier was, if you have two pieces of backing that you don't want to sew together, for whatever reason, it doesn't matter, then I put a piece of grosgrain ribbon safety pin to those backing to hold them together, so that when I quilt them, the compensation is taken care of with the grosgrain ribbon and everything happens the same way. So that's, you know, a thought process to think about. Now, we talked about the backing. Let's talk about the thread. So I've done, I think the most projects that I have done on the frame at once is about 26 different pieces. It was more than 25 and less than 30. Okay? So here's what you have to think about when you do this. First and foremost, I lay my quilt pieces, my things I'm going to quilt out, by what color I'm going to stitch them, top and bobbin. Also then I think about what batting am I going to use. So I want the backing to be whatever. I already know that I can have different backings. That's okay. The bobbin thread needs to be the same. I don't want to change my bobbin thread when I am on my left quilt and I go to my right quilt. I want to keep the bobbin thread the same. It would not be any fun quilting if I had to change the bobbin 24 times for 24 things if I'm trying to be efficient by quilting them at once. Okay? So I want the bobbin thread the same and I want the top thread the same. Now, saying that, if you think about it and you line things up and you say, okay, I have these 6 placemats and these 3 table runners and all these are going to be the same color threads, and I can put them on the frame and put something else that has a different color. I could change my top thread and my bobbin thread halfway through, but I wouldn't want to do it for every project, maybe every section of project. So if I roll once, so once I roll, I could change my thread color. And does everything have to line up the same when I roll? No. Things are offset, meaning that I might be 3 inches higher on one project than I am on the other, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I can roll back and forth, and so can you, with no difficulty. Now, what have you quilted on the quilt frame? So the question was, what have you quilted on the quilt frame other than quilts? So I've quilted quite a few things. So what else have you quilted? So some of you have quilted purses, some of you have quilted totes. So I'm going to give you an idea of what to think about and then see what you come up with, okay? Brenda has done wall hangings, placemats, dresser scarves. Great. Dresser scarves are wonderful. What about a dress-up scarf? What about, if you live in the cold weather, what about a winter scarf? My friend Barbara is on. She says she's boring. She only quilts and wall hangings. Well, but she has quilted more than one quilt on her frame at once. She and I did 2 round quilts on the frame at the same time. So think about that. The quilts were similar, but we did 2 round quilts on the frame at the same time. So here's some things to think about. What projects can you do? Projects can be different. They don't have to be the same. So these are things that I've quilted in the past. This piece of fabric is 2-inch blocks. I quilted 2-inch blocks, a whole bunch of fabric at the same time, and what I did was I made a stuffed teddy bear out of the 2-inch blocks. I quilted 2 of these I Spy quilts at the same time, and I quilted them long ways, meaning that I put it on the frame left to right. I didn't put it on the frame long ways. I utilized the most that I could space-wise on the frame. So that becomes extremely important. Okay, this Drunkard's Path quilt was quilted, and then on the side of that I quilted a scarf. So again, the projects can be different. What needs to be the same is the top and bobbin thread. So 2-inch squares sewn together, stitched. I Spy quilt. This little summer wall hanging, I did a couple of these at the same time. And then this is the Drunkard's Path. And then the scarf was stitched beside it. I took all the leftover batik, and then I made a batik scarf on the frame beside it. Okay, here's some more projects to think about. These are other things that I have made and quilted. Now, let's start at the top right, and we'll go counterclockwise. So this tote was a large rectangle that was stitched on the sewing machine. The squares were stitched on the sewing machine, and then quilted on the frame. So this particular tote bag was made almost entirely on the frame, other than the pieced 5-inch blocks. So now you're getting some ideas. Now you're thinking outside of that box, and sometimes we get stuck in a box. Now, Jane's got a really great question. She says, is anything without batting? If so, how does that look? Well, the scarf is quilted without batting, whether it's the winter scarf or whether it is the decorative fancy scarf. I do the fancy scarf sandwiched fabric between water-soluble thread. So my water-soluble stabilizer, excuse me. So think of this, Jane. You have a water-soluble stabilizer attached to your leaders. That's your backing. Then I put fabric on that, just scraps of fabric, and then I put another piece of water-soluble stabilizer on top, and then I just stitch all over. That's a decorative scarf. Could be a scarf for a dresser. My friend Lori loves it for a scarf for a dresser. The winter scarf is actually chenille made on the frame. So I want you to think about 7 layers of flannel, 7 layers of homespun, stitched out, makes a beautiful winter scarf. So things can be without batting. It just depends on what you're doing, how it looks. I've done denim by itself without batting. So I stitch all kinds of denim, and then I cut it up and make it into things. Now, I'm going to give you some things to really make you think, okay? That denim that I do, I stitch all over it, so now I'm creating a texturized denim. It could be 1 or 2 pieces of denim on the frame at once, but here's what I really enjoy doing, okay? I enjoy taking a pattern piece and recording it with the Quilt Magician or whatever robotics you have. So record the pattern piece, and then I have it stitch it out. So the dog coat, which Brenda says she really loves, and I'll tell you that dog loved that coat too. Her name is Sugar. The dog coat was a pattern piece I designed. So I pieced all the little squares, and then I stitched out the pattern with robotics. And I knew where to cut. So there's lots of different things that you can do. Now, Marie says that she took a class where they layered thread in water-soluble stabilizer and they quilted it to make a scarf. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, is taking water-soluble stabilizer. You can put thread in it, you can put confetti in it, you can put yarn in it, you can put fabric in it, and you can turn it into a scarf. And Barbara says that she did the rag quilts on the frame. So I did a class once where we did quilt blocks on the frame with layers of flannel and turned that into a rag quilt. And we did a couple rag quilts all at the same time on the frame. So is this helping you to visually see that you can do more than one thing on the frame at once? There are lots of things. So think about the space you have and how much can you put on the frame at once. So we did the little tote here. The next one, this one here. This is one of the 26 projects I put on the frame at once. So my girlfriend Phyllis and I, we went to a retreat, and all we did was make 48 different placemats and table runners. And then when we were finished, we brought them to the frame and we started quilting them all at once. So we separated them out, and then we figured out, okay, which one of these can we quilt at the same time so that our batting is the same, our bobbin is the same, and our top thread is the same. It didn't matter that the table runners and placemats and, you know, little trivets or little candle mat were not the same. What matters is that how we quilted it, what thread, batting, you know, top and bobbin thread and batting were the same. The design did not even have to be the same because we custom quilted. We quilted as we rolled, and we quilted each one that we did. Marie says that she saw a throw rug done, made out of layers of fabric similar to the rag quilts. And you can do that, or you can take the cheater panels and make throw rugs out of that by chenilling it. And we've done that before too. I've done a couple of those on the frame at once because we can do diagonal lines. We can do it with a ruler. We can do it with robotics. And we can make the chenille out of those layers of our pieces. So yes, you know, there's lots of different things to think about. So Karen says, so basically are you making quilt fabric and then cutting them up into finished projects? Yes and no. So this was specifically put together for a tote bag. I knew the dimensions that I wanted and I created the tote bag. This was specifically sewn together like this as a runner. The next piece answers Karen's question. This was some fabric I had from IKEA. I literally put all the fabric on the frame, and I had lots of pieced pieces for the backing, and I was just playing with learning how to line up, learning my pantographs, learning all of this stuff. And when I was done, I cut all of this fabric up and made it into projects. So out of that fabric, I made a garment bag, a tote bag, a shoe bag, a makeup bag, a dot bag, I made a couple other things out of that. Well, that's enough to give you an idea. So that specific one that you see here with the flower embroidered pocket was just fabric, and then I cut it up to make it into things. this pocket was a piece that I embroidered and never threw it away, and then when I was done I just cut it and made it into a pocket. So I try to be pretty frugal. When I'm learning something, I do it on fabric and I cut it up, and you know what? By the time I cut it up, you don't see the errors that I see. Nobody sees that. Okay? So I'm not as hard on myself as I used to be, but I know that you each are probably hard on yourselves, and you're going, oh, that pantograph didn't nest as well as I wanted, or I didn't line it up as well as I wanted. But you know what? When you do something like this to practice it on, it's okay. Heather has a great question, and I was just getting there, Heather, so I'm glad you reminded me of the question. She says, do you baste down the individual items, or would you just pin them and remove them as you go? I have actually done both. One of the machines that I have bastes, and one of the machines that I have does not. So when Barbara and I put our circle quilts on the frame, we basted them down. We set the basting stitch, and then we stitched around it, and we basted them down as we went. When Phyllis and I did these table runners, the machine that we did these on did not have the basting stitch, so we actually pinned them down. And sometimes I took water-soluble bobbin thread and basted them down as I went. So a basting method could be stitching them down and using water-soluble bobbin thread. So you have a couple options there when it comes to basting. Donna wants to know, do I paper piece? And I do paper piece, and I have done piecing on the frame. So we'll talk about that, and there are classes coming up in the future about piecing on the frame. So that covered that tote there that we were talking about. So the next one is Sugar's Coat, and this was a little project that I made. Again, another little sample, but the biggest thing about this was that it was made to learn that you can do pattern pieces on the frame. This is a small pattern piece, so this was a simple one to do, but you can do pattern pieces on the frame. These table runners were done on a retreat with my friend Barbara, and I made a whole bunch of these. And what we ended up doing with some of these, now I didn't do them with all of them, but I put these back on the frame. They were not on the frame. The way that these are put together is you don't do this on the frame, but I stitched them all together, and then I put them back on the frame, and I did do some quilting down the center of these. I did some quilting in the middle of some of these, so these can be put on the frame at the same time. You will put them with the lengthwise going left to right, and then that way you can stitch them all the way across. With leaders, I just pin the points onto the frame, so it makes it very, very easy for you to be able to do that. So Shirley says that when she bastes with thick poly batting, so she's using a high loft poly batting, so when she does that, she has trouble keeping the fabric smooth, and so her machine does not have a basting stitch. So the big thing with high loft poly batting is that's one where we will have to raise our foot up. If our foot is too low, it's going to shift that top fabric. So that top fabric, we want it to lay smooth. So that does make it a little more difficult when we're doing that. So a couple things that I would suggest to Shirley is use a water-soluble bobbin thread and make that thread or make that stitch as long as you can. Now, what I tend to do if I'm basting something down as I go, I have no issues with basting through the middle of something if I'm using a water-soluble bobbin thread, because it will come out easily, okay? A lot easier than me having to get the seam ripper out and use the seam ripper to do that. I call it Jack. So if you ever hear me say Jack, it's Jack the Ripper. So I don't want to use Jack if I don't have to. So I like the water-soluble bobbin thread because you can mist it with your iron and it will go away. So I would try to baste down the center. So let's just say we were doing this table runner right here and it's on the frame left to right. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch across the top of this, okay, and get that secure. Then I will probably stitch through it going down this way. Then I will stitch across here. Now, once I go through the center with my basting, I will have to go from center to the left and then center to the right. You don't want to go from right to left or left to right once you baste through that center because it's going to shift it. The other thing, that don't be afraid to go on 45-degree angles because this is a pointed octagonal hex corners. Don't be afraid to say, okay, I'm going to go this way and then this way. And the more you can baste with the higher loft batting, Shirley, the easier it's going to be. And so I hope that makes sense, that I like to baste a lot when I'm using a high loft batting. And I do use a high loft batting to do trapunto and things like that. So I do use high loft battings. But baste more and raise that foot up a little higher than what you normally do. Once you baste it, then you can lower it back down to where it needs to be. So Barbara wants to know, what did you have behind the black and white table runners that you pinned it on? I used leaders and I pinned only this tip. So I'm not quilting the whole piece. I'm quilting maybe some feathers down the center, maybe a motif in the center here, but I'm not quilting all the way to the edge. So I just use these points on this table runner to pin that to the leader. So I want you to think about this. And when you watch the companion video to this, you're going to see exactly on the frame what you see here. You have a table runner and a placemat on the same frame, or placemats. So in my visual, that's 6 placemats, 1 table runner, okay? And I can add more table runners. So maybe for the holiday, or maybe for a gift that I give somebody, somebody's going to get 4 placemats and 1 table runner because I really, really like them. And then the next person's going to get 2 placemats and 1 table runner. And I really, really like them, but there's only 2 people in their family and they have a little intimate table. And then maybe the next person, I really like them, but I'm only making them a table runner. There's nothing wrong with that. 3 table runners, 6 placemats, it works. Or maybe everybody gets 2 placemats and 1 runner. So think about, how can you load your frame and have as much on it as possible? How can you get the most out of your frame? So I've loaded placemats and runners. I just take a big piece of fabric, make it, and I just load as much as I can. As Karen asked, do I just load fabric and quilt it? Sometimes I just load fabric and quilt it. Sometimes it's a lesson. Sometimes it's something that I'm learning. So it really varies on what I put on the frame. By what do I have? Same bobbin, same top thread. The batting the same for some of them, but remember, I can change that as I go. And why do I do this? Because I can get more done. I have a 10-foot or 12-foot frame. I want to fill it as much as possible. If you have a 10-foot or 12-foot frame, don't you want to put as much on it as you can? So, Jane has a question. Can you use a stiffy batting? So, I have a product that's a foundation batting. And some of you might have used it. I'm not sure. But it's a batting that is very, very stiff, but it's not stiff like Temtex stiff or a Bond. There's a couple of stabilizers that are a Bond type stabilizer. It's a foundation batting. And yes, you can use a stiff batting. Yes, you can use a stiff stabilizer, but you will need to change your needle. Now, the needle will also vary by what thread you're going to use, because the bigger the needle, the more the thread will slosh and move around in the needle. So my go-to is, I usually say, start out with 100 needle. That's the middle of the road kind of. It's not too big, it's not too small. And see what happens. If you have good luck with that 100, then keep using that. A stiff batting, you might, or stabilizer, you might have to change the needle more often. Okay? So think about that too. You'll hear pinging and ticking and things like that when you need to change your needle. If the thread is breaking at the needle, your needle might be too small and the thread is breaking right at that needle sometimes. So you might try going a size up, 110. There are needles that go all the way up to 130. So there are big horse needles and there are very fine needles. So if you wanted to quilt with silk and things like that. So, keep that in mind, that needles and all of that stuff will change. So my question to you now is, are you thinking outside of the box? Does this help you to see, I can do more than one project on the frame at a time? And that's really what this is all about. If we could bottle time, we would be rich. And I don't know how to bottle time, but I know how to help you to save time. And so, can you see where you might try a few projects on the frame at the same time? Maybe a couple wall hangings on the frame at the same time? Maybe you'd like to try some table runners or placemats on the frame at the same time. And what's really fun is there's a lot of things out there for you to be able to try. Marie says she quilted with some batting called Soft and Stable, and she thinks that it was called for in backpacks, and it was about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it worked great. And that's about what my product that I sell in the market. It's called Simply Stable, and it's about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it works very well also. People that use it love it. I use it a lot for placemats and table runners and things like that because it gives them some substance. So are you ready to go and quilt multiple items on the frame? If you are, it's time to try it. Don't be afraid. Again, as always, I say start small. A couple placemats and a table runner. 2 cheater quilts. Do 1 freehand and 1 robotic. So try it and see what happens.